A virtual world unfolds where people plunder and slaughter one another as if they're in a game of GTA. The leader of a famous guild known as the Knights of Glory, Master Devea, has just received word from one of her spies that a dangerous assassin named Rate has appeared. One member pointed out that it's normal for assassins to be deployed before a castle siege begins. However, Devea replied that this assassin is especially powerful, and they'll have to give it their all just to have a chance against him. Shortly after, Master Devea spotted a flock of birds flying towards them, and ordered her guild members to shoot them all down. However, the guild members thought attacking the birds was just a pointless waste of time. But those weren't ordinary birds. They were mechanical birds controlled by Rate. They were in position and began to counterattack the guild. A massive explosion occurred, and unfortunately, Master Devea was the only one to take the fatal blow. She lay on the ground, her skin looking like an overcooked steak. Her teammates screamed her name in anguish. Suddenly, Devea played her trump card and was instantly revived, with magical circles swirling around her head and body. Devea said it was all thanks to the sacrificial magic tool she wears around her neck. This item can substitute for its wearer when they take a fatal hit, and it's powerful enough to let them cheat death. A truly rare feat. Everything was orchestrated by Rate, making the guild members realize his true level of danger. Devea also warned that the sacrificial magic tool has its limits and needs time to reactivate, so they can't let their guard down like before. Just moments later, Devea noticed something strange on the ground. But before she could figure it out, she was engulfed by the flames of another explosion. She collapsed, her body weak and exhausted. Suddenly, a pillar crumbled and fell right on top of her. With her last breath, Devea began to wonder how there could be explosives in this building. She wondered if this entire situation was Rate's plan, and if the explosives could have been planted when the building was first constructed. Shortly after, one of Rate's mechanical birds circled the area, controlled by him from his headquarters, to inform Devea that the last explosion was no ordinary one, but a magic energy injection device. Just then, the mechanical bird reported that Rate had just received a new message, congratulating him on completing his mission. As a result, he received a gold ingot as a reward. Rate explained that normally, the maximum depth at which an explosion can affect someone on the surface is 5 meters. Any explosion deeper than that would have no effect, as the blast energy would be absorbed by the ground. However, that's only true for conventional explosives. What Rate used was a magic energy injection device. When pumped with a huge amount of magic, it will detonate from even the slightest impact. Rate went on to explain that no matter how solid your assassination techniques are, someone will always find a counter. But that doesn't matter to him, because no matter how many countermeasures people prepare, Rot will always invent a new way to assassinate them with his production skills. For him, that's how things are, and always will be. The production job is exactly what it sounds like, a class that creates things. However, the real-life Rate was unemployed and a failure, so he decided to do the next best thing, become an assassin in a VR MMO, because his real life was just too bleak and hopeless. The name of this game is Virtual Life Online, or VLO. In VLO, death is a serious matter, because when a player dies, they lose 1 level. Not only that, but they're also banned from logging in for 3 days, which has severe consequences, especially for high-level players. Losing 1 level means losing 100 hours of gameplay. All that effort reduced to something as worthless as a cheap can of chopped liver. But the game's developers were unforgiving. They even created a harsher penalty, a complete login ban for an extended period. For example, if a guild war over territory breaks out, and a guild's main force is taken down and can't log back in time for the fight, that guild is guaranteed to lose. Many guilds have suffered from having their key players eliminated at the worst possible moment, leading to their complete collapse during crucial wars. However, in VLO, actual player death is rare. In the worst-case scenario, players are just knocked unconscious and need to be revived in town. Only a handful of major bosses and a few other players are actually capable of successfully killing another player. If you get killed too often, just like in any other MMO, you'll be considered useless. In battles between top-tier guilds, each side usually hires dozens of assassins for support. So it's not uncommon to see 2 or more assassins clashing, especially when it comes to assassination battles. Wright is considered an exceptional assassin, recognized by everyone, except for his family. He isn't your typical assassin with boring artery-slicing skills or dual-wielding swords. Instead, he has a production job and uses poisons and explosives to eliminate his enemies. Rate knows full well that he'd lose in a direct confrontation. But he doesn't have to, because his methods of assassination have no counter. To put it in perspective, if an assassin targets a high-level guild, they're considered excellent if they have a success rate of 15% or higher. However, Rate's assassination success rate is over 99.9%. Statistically, this means failure is virtually impossible for him, model. Rate had taken on over 1,000 assassination missions and had only failed once. He was confident his success rate was the highest among all assassins in VLO. As Rate was strolling through the city, he suddenly received a letter, not the usual kind he was used to. He opened it and saw it was from a player named Goddess Mises, who was asking for his help. Rate wondered who Goddess Mises was and immediately thought it had to be a joke. Because in VLO there were restrictions on character names, any name containing the word God or 69 was forbidden. This only strengthened his belief that the letter was a pointless scam, especially since the sender called herself Goddess Mises. Despite not believing she existed, Rate searched for the name Goddess Mises, thinking that if she were real, he'd be able to hear her voice. To his surprise, the device connected successfully and he heard her voice clearly. Rate immediately asked how she was able to use a name containing the word God and whether the ban had been lifted. Goddess Mises replied that she had that name because she was, in fact, a god and also the one who created the game. With her admin privileges, she could choose any name she wanted. Even Godslayer69. Rate heard this but didn't believe a word of it. Her claim of being the game's creator made Rate wonder just how delusional this person was. Even so, he decided to play along with her story and asked for the mission details. She explained that the mission was to assassinate a god from another world, known as Masura Zul. Since Rate knew the names of all the powerful players by heart, he realized he'd never heard of this name before, and quickly concluded it would be an easy target. All he needed was the target's location. Rate was focused, committed, and very professional. So he immediately asked about the reward for this mission, requesting to be paid in gold. Mises agreed, and offered to pay him 1,000 tons of pure gold. Since Rate had been broke his entire life, he couldn't believe his ears when she proposed such a massive reward. He demanded that she be serious about the payment. But Mises was serious about the 1,000-ton gold reward, equivalent to 5 million yen, although she would pay the entire sum on the other side. Rate still didn't believe it and wondered when she would snap out of her delusion. However, he suddenly changed his mind and decided to accept the mission with a smirk. Mises was pleased to hear this and thanked him, saying that if he hadn't accepted, she would have considered herself as good as dead. Rate thought she was being a bit overdramatic, since this was just a game. However, Mises insisted that this was no ordinary game. Just then, Rate noticed his teleportation stone had suddenly activated. This was strange because teleportation stones never activate on their own. As the magical energy enveloped his body, Mises mentioned that she didn't have a chance to explain what was happening, so she would send him to the target immediately. Amid the chaos, Rate demanded time to prepare, as he was terrible at close combat and needed information about the target to prepare countermeasures. However, Mises said that he couldn't bring any foreign items with him, which rendered all his plans useless. This left Rate completely helpless, as he wouldn't be able to bring his poisons or explosives, the very things he relied on for assassinations. Mises also explained that the teleportation stone would take him to another world, which Rate didn't understand at all. However, Goddess Mises believed that Rate was the most suitable person for this mission, as his skills and knowledge would be incredibly useful in that other world. His target was the evil god Masura Zul, the only remaining god in that world. Rate appeared in a green meadow, with his hand on the ground, wondering where he was. He observed a lush green forest, full of trees and animals, so he decided to use his GPS to pinpoint his location. However, when he opened his item box, he was stunned to find it completely empty. It turned out Goddess Mises wasn't joking when she said he couldn't bring any foreign items into this world. Rate began to wander through the strange forest, which looked very similar to the landscapes in VLO, but the quality was far too sharp and realistic for a game. This sight made him slowly begin to believe Mises' words, that he had truly been brought to another world. Just then, the voice of Goddess Mises came from the communication device he had used to call her earlier. Mises apologized for sending Rate to the wrong location, explaining that her power wasn't strong enough. The population of her believers had sharply declined, preventing her from using her full power. Rate was still confused, not understanding what she was talking about. Mises went on to explain that the source of a god's power is the faith of their believers. If a god loses all their believers, they lose their power and eventually vanish. When a god disappears, all memories of them also vanish from the world. Rate realized that being a god wasn't easy at all. Mises also informed him that all the other gods had been wiped out by the evil god Masurazul. At last, Rate understood the situation, realizing he had been summoned by a goddess in her final moments to assassinate her rival god. Rate then asked the obvious question. Besides Mises and Masurazul, were all the other gods really gone? Goddess Mises confirmed that was true. Mises also said that Masurazul had many disciples, and their purpose was to reduce the number of followers of other gods. These disciples would even murder the followers of other gods or torture them until they changed their beliefs. Suddenly, the goddess's holographic image began to fade, as she hadn't subscribed to an unlimited service plan and had run out of energy to maintain contact. Rate panicked and begged her not to abandon him in this terrifying forest, but Mises could only speak in broken sentences due to the poor connection. Her last words were that when her power returned, she would definitely give him the promised reward. Rate realized he had been thrown into the wilderness like trash and now had to fend for himself. However, he didn't regret taking this mission as he found it quite interesting. Rate decided to see to his own safety before starting the assassination campaign. He wandered through the forest but found no trace of human life. Rate recalled that although he couldn't bring any external items, he could still use his basic VLO skills. He activated his enemy search skill and detected numerous monsters in the forest, which he assessed as a medium threat. Rate quickly concluded that this forest wasn't safe. Then, he used magic to create pure water, and realized that if he could use magic, he could also use his production skills. This led him to believe he could live a pretty easy life in this world. Rate realized he needed to gather items quickly if he didn't want to become Monster Chow. First, he needed to find metal, and after scouting the forest, he discovered some bauxite. But this wasn't Minecraft, so he had to mine and craft it by hand. He placed 2 fingers on the bauxite ore and activated his extraction skill, obtaining about 500 grams of pure aluminum. Rate then used his shaping skill to craft a needle from the collected aluminum. Although this needle dealt very little damage, he found a way to compensate for that weakness. He bent down and plucked a poisonous plant called deathroot, extracted the toxic sap from its roots and coated the needle's tip, creating a makeshift weapon. However, Rate knew this weapon wouldn't be strong enough against high-level monsters. Rate tried to open his item box and check his status, but the system completely ignored him. The status screen didn't appear, proving that this environment was completely different from the VLO game. Not only that, but he also had no items, making it impossible for him to accurately measure his own strength. The only way to gauge his power was by using his skills, so he activated the martial arts skill Crush Kick to destroy a tree trunk. This was a reasonable measure of his strength, and he realized his attack skills were as powerful as he'd expected. He assumed his stats in this world were equivalent to his VLO stats. As it started to get dark, Rate decided to build a house to live in. He used his shaping skill to craft an aluminum saw, then used it to cut trees into logs and stack them in a triangular shape. Despite having arms as weak as spaghetti, he still managed to dig a foundation, preparing for the build. However, he didn't build the house in a boring, manual way. With the help of magic, he could erect the house in a matter of minutes. After it was finished, Rate stepped inside and enjoyed the new house smell. But he quickly realized the house was too big for one person to live in alone, spacious enough to host a huge party, yet lacking the most important thing, friends. He then decided he needed to get more food and, more importantly, find some mana stones. Rate wanted to craft artifacts, which were items that used mana stones as a power source to activate various types of magic. However, mana stones could only be found inside monster bodies, and they had to be manually retrieved, and so he decided it was time to hunt. The amount of aluminum he'd collected wasn't enough to craft a proper melee weapon, and poison needles would contaminate the prey's meat. He decided to use a piece of wood, combined with his transformation skill, to craft a wooden bow. Next, he needed a bowstring, but making one was no simple task. Rate extracted fibers from a plant stalk, and while the fibers were still elastic, he wove them into thread. Then he braided the threads together to increase their durability. After a painstaking crafting process, the bow was complete. He also crafted some arrows from the leftover aluminum. With everything ready, Rate entered the forest and used his enemy search skill. He detected the nearest enemy in the 2 o'clock direction. So he climbed onto a branch, striking a pose so professional even Green Arrow would be impressed. Rate spotted a large frog sitting on a rock and wondered if it was edible. He fired an arrow, which flew true and pierced the frog's side. However, the arrow wasn't strong enough to take down the frog. The frog, enraged, spotted the location of the shot and quickly leaped towards the tree where Rate was standing. It jumped very high, approaching the branch where Rate stood. But when it got there, Rate was gone, as if to say, "Not this time, pal." Rate appeared right below the frog, at the perfect angle to land a fatal shot on the ugly creature. Even though many arrows had pierced its body, the frog refused to give up and prepared to unleash one final attack. It shot its disgusting tongue towards Rate, but at the same time, he fired a precisely calculated shot, aiming straight for its uvula. As soon as the arrow hit its mark, he calmly said, "When one shot isn't enough, you just need to add a few more." After completing the mission, Rate returned home and began to think about how to prepare the frog meat. Apparently, he decided to cook the frog meat he had just hunted. After finishing his meal, Rate noted that the frog meat tasted like chicken. However, he thought to himself that perhaps this wilderness life was making him go crazy for the food to seem so appealing. With this hearty meal, his survival had now switched to super easy mode. However, monster frog meat wasn't the kind you could eat carelessly, as it contained about 10 poison sacs. Rate was careful not to break any of the sacs because if he did, the entire cut of meat would be poisoned. In the end, he had obtained a mana stone, and based on the monster frog's strength, this mana stone was equally as powerful. That meant this stone would be very useful to him. At this point, he had food, a mana stone, and had defeated a monster. Now, his ultimate goal was to destroy the evil god Masurazul, though he still wasn't sure about the god's evil nature. Besides, he hadn't fully trusted the goddess Mises from the start, but that no longer mattered to Rate, as he had accepted the contract with goddess Mises, and his mission was to eliminate the target. No further arguments needed. A few minutes later, Rate decided to create some artifacts using the mana stones obtained from the ugly frog. He sat down and decided he would craft an artifact capable of detecting magic. However, he only had a vague memory of the production process, and the available materials were quite scarce, but he decided to give it a try anyway. Rate used his transmutation skill to craft a tool that resembled a magic hammer, used to imbue magic into materials. He began to strike the metal surface with this tool, and the process of crafting the artifact officially began. The artifact he was creating would be used to detect magic, that is, the sources of magical power used to cast various kinds of spells. Rate knew that both animals and monsters could possess magical power. However, only humans could use this artifact, meaning it would only activate when a person used magic nearby. After a period of continuous hammering, a spike formed at the tip of the initially rectangular metal plate, acting as an antenna to increase the device's sensitivity. It was no exaggeration to say that the quality of the magic detector depended entirely on the power of the mana stone and the spike used to craft it. Therefore, the spike wasn't made with Rate's transmutation skill, but was slowly imbued with magic and shaped, while enchantments were layered on one by one. Simply put, transmutation magic couldn't compare to forging and enchanting. After a while, the spike was saturated with magic and had reached its limit. This was the maximum the material could withstand, so Rate decided that the device was complete. He then chanted "bind" and "bestow," marking the completion of the magic detector. Rate believed the device could detect any magic within a 1-kilometer radius, but he wanted to test it anyway. He used magic to fill a cup with pure water, and the device immediately detected it. That proved the device worked correctly. Rai took a sip of water, enjoying the fruits of his labor. But just then, his stomach rumbled with a fierce hunger, signaling it was time for dinner. Rate took the frog meat he had obtained earlier, skewered it, and placed it around the campfire to roast. He sat down by the campfire and tried to use his forge fire skill to light it. However, after attempting to cast the spell, Rate was exhausted and out of mana. So he decided to conserve his magic power and use only the minimum amount necessary. A moment later, the fire was blazing, and the meat began to cook in the heat. Rate was about to take the meat off to eat, but decided to leave it on the fire a little longer. He also hoped that this meal wouldn't give him diarrhea, since he hadn't built a toilet yet, and didn't want to create an awkward situation in his pants. Suddenly, his 2 brain cells rubbed together, and he came up with a brilliant idea. He decided to indulge in a bit of luxury by seasoning the meat with salt. Once the meat was cooked through and perfectly salted, Rate blew on it lightly to cool it down, then took the first bite. He was amazed that just a little salt could make such a big difference in flavor. Rate had assumed the frog meat would be very bland, but in reality it was surprisingly fatty. After the meal, looking at the leftover meat, he began to wonder what he would do with it. Rate wanted to find a way to preserve the meat, but realized he would need a mana stone to create a refrigerator or freezer. However, the only way to get a mana stone was to fight monsters, and he was in no mood for that. So he thought about storing the meat in his item box, but was afraid it would rot. Even though he knew it was a stupid idea, Rate put the meat into the item box anyway since there was no other choice. He told himself that if the meat spoiled, he'd deal with it later. With no mattress yet, he lay down temporarily on the wooden floor. Rot then realized it was time to search for people in this world, but he wasn't sure if they would be friendly. He understood that a stranger he met might attack him on sight just because of his ugly face. Therefore, he knew he couldn't go out without proper preparation. In the meantime, he decided to focus on brewing magic potions. He had fought the day before without any potions, and it was a horrifying experience he didn't want to repeat. The next morning, Rate walked out of the house with his back hunched. He had slept on the floor last night without a mattress or futon, making his body ache all over. He decided his new mission was to find himself a mattress. After walking through the forest for a while, he happened to find the herb he needed for brewing potions. Coincidentally, this plant grew very close to his house. It was a common plant called Mayas herb, ranked as the lowest class among medicinal herbs. However, if properly enchanted and brewed, it could be used to make a level 2 potion. Rate harvested all the Mayas herb he could find. And once he had gathered enough, he brought them home to begin the brewing process. First, he crushed the herbs while pouring in a little bit of magic. Then, he mixed the plant sap with water and put it on the stove to boil. Rate waited awkwardly while the mixture boiled. Finally, after a long while, he had successfully brewed a level 2 potion. Rate was pleased at how easy it was to make low-level potions. The high-level potions that powerful players in VLO used to create were level 11, and compared to them, a level 2 potion was nothing, about 500 times weaker. However, even a level 2 potion was better than nothing. Still, if possible, he wanted to brew a few level 4 potions, but decided to leave that for later. Rate realized he had made a mistake by not having any containers ready for the potion, so he used his shaping skill to quickly create a few flasks. He filled 5 flasks with the potion, which would be a great help on the battlefield. After finishing, he stepped out of his house and decided to scout the area to hunt monsters and collect magic stones. These stones would be used to create more useful artifacts. Rate used his enemy search skill to scan the area, and took down every monster he came across. He gathered a large number of magic stones, enough to craft many necessary artifacts. The first artifact he decided to create was flashbangs. He started by using his magic to crush a magic stone. This felt like a waste, but he couldn't make a flashbang without breaking the magic stone, so he had no other choice. Rate crushed the magic stones until they became a fine powder known as mana fragments. The next step was to imbue these fragments with magic. However, even with the magic infusion, the effect was only fleeting, as each fragment emitted a faint light for just a moment. However, combining hundreds of thousands of fragments would create a blinding flash of light. Rate understood that he couldn't use the powder in its raw form, so he used his fusion skill to turn the powder into a solid container. He didn't feel safe with just one flashbang, so he decided to make 3 just to be sure. He continued to crush more magic stones until the next morning. That morning, he was finally done. Although crafting them took all night, it was still much less demanding than creating high-level items. Suddenly, his magic detector started beeping non-stop, which confused him since he wasn't using any magic at that moment. He immediately realized that someone nearby was using magic. Rate then grabbed his magic detector and his bow and ran quickly in the direction where he sensed the magic. He didn't know who was using the magic, whether they were friend or foe, but he had to go check. However, chances were they weren't friendly. The magic detector pointed in the direction of the strongest magical source, and Rate followed its guidance closely, using his stealth support skill to hide himself. Just then, he heard a scream ring out, telling someone to run from the area because it was dangerous. Rate used this voice to pinpoint the exact location and continued to move closer. He hid on a tree branch and saw an ugly bear monster threatening a father and his children. Rate also noticed an injured man lying on the ground and an extremely beautiful but terrified teenage girl, anxiously asking about the man's condition. This man didn't look like a warrior, and to make matters worse, the knight trying to protect them had also been severely wounded in the shoulder, a wound that showed signs of poison. Rate realized that if he didn't act immediately, they would be dead within 5 minutes. Deciding to save them, he quickly gathered information, before landing on the scene in a cool, Batman-style pose. The bear roared upon seeing his frightening face, but Rate wasn't bothered at all. He threw a flashbang, which emitted a blinding light, creating the perfect opportunity to land a stunning blow. Immediately after, he shot out the poison needles he had crafted beforehand. However, Rate quickly realized this monster might be a higher rank than any he had ever faced. Therefore, the poison needles alone certainly wouldn't be enough to take it down. In this situation, Rate decided to increase the poison's dosage and swapped the poisoned needle for a poisoned arrow. He knocked the arrow to his bow, aiming straight at the bear, while also warning the girl not to move unless she wanted to complete this mission by herself. Rate fired an arrow, piercing the bear's back, which drove it mad and forced it to focus all its attention on him. The bear turned into Mike Tyson, starting to throw powerful punches toward Rate. However, Rate skillfully dodged all of its attacks. He waited patiently. His plan was nearing completion. The poison on the arrow was a mixture of 3 different types of enum magic. The first was a neurotoxin extracted from deathroot, known to be the most potent of the 3. The second was a hemotoxin, created from poison mushrooms, intended to ensure the death of monsters that might be immune to neurotoxins. Just as the bear was about to turn Rate into a late lunch, it suddenly froze and stopped its attack. Rate strode majestically past the bear, leaving the completely paralyzed monster behind him. Rate showed off his skills in Power Ranger style. This was all thanks to the third poison, a paralytic agent extracted from the venom sac of a monster frog he had killed earlier. This venom paralyzed the victim, allowing the other poisons time to take effect. It also inhibited brain activity, reducing the monster's pain, so it wouldn't be aware of its own condition until moments before its death. That way, it wouldn't thrash around in desperation, as death was already inevitable. When the survivors regained their sight after the flash from the stun grenade, they were astonished to see the bear collapsed on the ground, while the stranger, thin but mysterious, stood there victoriously. They wondered who this stranger was. The injured soldier hesitantly asked Rate if he was the one who killed the bear. Rate nodded, confirming that he was the one who took it down. He also remarked that since the soldier could still move, the bear's poison must be very slow-acting. However, the deep cut on the soldier's chest looked extremely serious, and he predicted that the victim would die from blood loss before the poison could reach his heart. Rate approached to administer first aid, but the soldier stopped him, saying that even though Rate had saved their lives, he couldn't allow him to come any closer. Rate said he didn't care if they stopped him, reminding them that the injured man on the ground would die if they did nothing. While speaking, Rate referred to the injured man as the old man, which angered the soldier, who said that the injured man was a very important person. Rate retorted that if the man was that important, it would be even worse to let him die. The soldier understood Rate's logic and realized he had no choice but to accept help from this stranger. Finally, the soldier agreed to let Rate help, and although Rate offered no guarantees, he promised to do his best. Rate handed the soldier a potion bottle and told him to give it to the injured man. The soldier took the bottle, smelled it, observed it, and even tasted it to make sure it wasn't harmful. Rate told the soldier to randomly pick any potion bottle, and promised that whichever one was chosen, he would drink it to prove it wasn't harmful. The soldier chose a bottle and Rate downed it in one go. This act from Rate dispelled the soldier's suspicions. The beautiful teenage girl then offered to help, wanting to give the older man, who was actually her father, the potion. After drinking the potion, his wounds immediately began to heal and his face became more handsome, strangely enough. Everyone was amazed by the power of the potion Rate made and wondered if it was a high-tier potion. However, Rate explained that it was just a basic Tier 2 potion. He was surprised but figured they probably weren't familiar with potion making. Rate then gave the soldier a healing potion, suggesting he drink it since the soldier was also injured. The soldier humbly replied that he was just an ordinary guard, so the potion should be saved for someone who needed it more. Rate bluntly told him to shut up and drink the potion because he had plenty more. After the soldier finished drinking, he said he was in Rate's debt. However, Rate reminded him that if he didn't deal with the bear's poison quickly, he would still die despite drinking the potion. The soldier was shocked to learn that Rate could do something about the poison. Rate checked on the soldier's condition and asked how far the venom had spread in his body. The soldier replied that he only felt a slight numbness in his fingers. Rate immediately deduced that it was a paralytic poison, and if left untreated, the poison would spread to his heart, causing him to die slowly. However, Rate couldn't brew an antidote right there in the forest, so he offered to take them to his home to prepare an antidote for the bear's venom. The soldier carried the injured man on his back, and the group walked to Rate's house together. Upon entering, they were stunned to see a house like Rate's existing in the middle of this harsh wilderness. Rate commented that although the house was nice, it was still quite empty. Rate urged them to wait in the living room, while he went to brew the antidote and bring it to them. The soldier wondered if Rate was a doctor, as he was clearly very knowledgeable about medicine. Rate replied that he wasn't an expert on medicine. He just knew how to do a lot of things. Rate then advised the soldier to watch how the antidote was made, if he wanted to ensure his own safety in the future. The soldier accepted the advice, but asked for a few minutes to put the frail old man to bed. A moment later, Rate offered the soldier a drink of water, and he drank it immediately without any hesitation. Rate asked about his condition, and the soldier replied that his entire arm was now completely numb. He worriedly wondered if it was too late to save him. Rate reassured him that there was nothing to worry about, as they had plenty of time. The poison had only spread to his arm, which indicated it was progressing quite slowly. Rate was confident that at its current speed, he would finish brewing the antidote long before it was too late. Even though the quality of the herbs he had gathered wasn't great, but if he prepared it carefully, he could still work around the issue. Rate also noted that creativity was key when using low-quality ingredients to make medicine. A moment later, the antidote was ready and 2 bowls of the medicine were placed in front of the soldier and the girl. The soldier took a drink from one bowl first to make sure it wasn't poisoned. As soon as he drank it, his eyes widened in amazement at the medicine's effect. The paralyzing sensation vanished completely without a trace. Rate then suggested that he give the medicine to the old man, as his condition was more critical, and he wouldn't make it if they didn't act fast. The girl rushed the medicine into her father's room and gave it to him immediately. As a result, the color returned to his face, making him look more youthful than before. Rate then explained that he had neutralized the poison in the old man's system, and had administered first aid for his wounds. He assured them that if the man got enough rest, he would wake up soon. Rate gave the girl another vial of medicine, reminding her that it should only be used in an emergency. Once everyone was healed, Rate expressed his desire to talk. He wanted to know who they were and what they were doing in the area where he had found them. The girl spoke up, saying she would explain their identities, but he would have to wait for her father to wake up so he could explain for himself why they were in the forest. The soldier introduced himself as Goldo, a royal guard of the Mythis kingdom. The girl introduced herself as Lumia Mathis, princess of the Mythis kingdom, and her father as Lias Mythis, the 14th king of the Mythis kingdom. Rate was used to avoiding negotiations with high-status people, but this time he was dealing with a king. He realized he had to be careful with his actions, and carefully considered what his next move should be. Lumia pleaded with Rate to keep their identities and her father's royal status a secret. Rate decided he no longer wanted to be known by his old name, so he created a new one and introduced himself as Late, a name that sounded similar to his real one. He seemed proud of this clever idea and said that for now they should wait for the king to wake up, and then they would decide on the next step. Lumia asked Late if he intended to help them. From this question, Late realized that they were in need of some kind of help. Lumia suddenly realized she had let something slip and quickly covered her mouth, while Goldo gave her a disappointed look. Late decided they would discuss that matter later, and suggested everyone get something to eat. He was seen outside, taking out the monster frog meat he had stored in his item box earlier, and was surprised that it was still fresh, unlike his completely hopeless hairstyle. It turned out that food stored in the item box didn't spoil and remained perfectly fresh. A moment later, he began roasting the meat over a campfire. Princess Lumia came over to his side, curiously asking what he was doing. Light calmly replied that he was preparing monster frog skewers, but he didn't know the creature's name. Lumia was stunned at the thought of eating a monster whose name they didn't even know. Late added that there was no risk of poisoning since he already had antidotes prepared. Lumia was impressed by his logical thinking, which surprised Late, as he thought she would complain that such a meal wasn't fit for a princess like her. Just then, Goldo appeared and suddenly turned into a karate master, delivering a sharp chop through the air between Late and Lumia, separating them. He warned Lumia not to fall for Late's tricks, stressing that he himself was once a commoner. He said that normal people don't just casually eat unidentified monsters. However, Late paid no attention to Goldo's words. and continued eating the frog meat, remarking that the fatty parts made the dish more tender and delicious. Goldo added that they didn't have any food reserves with them and blurted out that they were in a complicated situation. Late quickly picked up on that, but decided to wait for the king to awaken for a proper interrogation. Late once again offered the meat to Goldo, asking him to test if it was poisoned, as he sensed that despite helping them, they still didn't fully trust him. Goldo accepted, and with the very first bite, the gloomy life of a royal guard suddenly transformed into the fantastic daydream of a bored, middle-aged man. A sunny day at the beach with a gorgeous woman chasing after him. Goldo praised Late's meat, saying it was delicious. Lumia then asked Goldo if she could have Late's meat, the cooked kind, not in the metaphorical sense. Goldo nodded his approval since he hadn't experienced any issues with the food. Lumia was about to eat, but then had a thought. Wait a minute, I'm a princess. She requested that Late provide a plate for her to eat from. Late quickly used his creation skill to whip up a plate on the spot. Both Goldo and Lumia were stunned by the way Late created an object out of thin air. Lumia took a bite, and her mind took flight into a fantasy just as Goldo's had. However, her fantasy was rather strange. She was in a bikini, having a romantic time with a bizarre frog man. A few minutes later, Late noticed Goldo had stopped eating, so he asked what was wrong. Goldo replied that as a royal guard, he shouldn't eat when rations were scarce. Late assured him there was more than enough of his meat to go around for everyone. No innuendo intended. Goldo immediately agreed and explained that he felt more indebted to Late than an Ivy League student is to their student loans. Goldo added that even in his own castle, there was no meat as delicious as what they had just eaten. Lumia recalled Late saying it was frog meat, and she was surprised that frogs from this forest could taste so good. Lumia wondered if it could be a Gallia frog. Goldo reminded her that Gallia frogs are very difficult to prepare, and they aren't a species that just anyone can easily find in the forest. However, Lumia said she had eaten Gallia frogs before, and they tasted exactly like the frog dish that Late had cooked. She also recalled that when they were in the castle, the king had requested this dish once, but out of hundreds of royal chefs, only one could make it edible. Late was curious and asked, "So what makes it so hard to prepare?" Goldo explained that inside a Gallia frog's body, there are about 10 fragile poison sacs. If even one sac is accidentally torn, the entire frog becomes contaminated with poison and cannot be eaten. The method for preparing a Gallia frog sounded familiar to Late, so he took out the frog meat he had hunted and asked if it was a Gallia frog. Lumia and Goldo were astonished to realize that it was indeed a real Gallia frog. And what's more, its body was completely unharmed. Late handed the frog to Goldo, shoving it right in his face, which pissed Goldo off because of Late's audacity. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, startling Late since he wasn't expecting anyone to visit his home so abruptly. Goldo shouted to ask who was outside the door. A voice replied that he recognized Goldo's voice and introduced himself as Russell, his comrade. Goldo told Raisel to come in, and a boy who looked like he'd skipped every gym day walked in. It was Raisel, another royal guard in the royal family. Raisel saw Princess Lumia and was relieved that she was safe and sound. Goldo asked Raisel if he had found any help. Raisel replied that he hadn't found anyone yet, and this was the first house he had come across. When he knocked, he found out that everyone was inside. Raisel then stared at Late and asked suspiciously what this stranger was doing here with the princess. He also wondered about this place, as it seemed strange to him. Goldo explained that this was Late's house. Raisel was confused upon hearing the name and wondered if Late was a friend or a foe. Goldo clarified that Late was just a commoner, although he didn't look like an ordinary person. Princess Lumia added that Late had helped them a great deal. He had killed the monster that attacked them and healed everyone's wounds. Even the king was currently resting in one of Late's rooms. The king had been poisoned by the monster, but Late had created an incredibly effective antidote, and thanks to that, the king would be fine. Raisel was suspicious of the strange convenience of a stranger like Late just happening to appear and being so eager to help. He suspected that Late had a hidden agenda and urged Goldo and the princess to leave this place immediately. Lumia reminded Raisel that the forest was teeming with dangerous monsters and there was no place safer than this house. She was also displeased with the way Raisel spoke about the person who had saved both her and her father's lives. Russell was shocked by the way the princess raised her voice at him, as it was very rare for her to get so angry. Late then opened and closed the window to prove that they weren't being held captive. He made it clear that if he truly had ill intentions, he wouldn't have let them move freely in an unlocked room. However, Russell still didn't buy Late's story. Late calmly said that if he really wanted to, he could kill all of them, even if they attacked him together. But he wasn't doing that because he had no intention of doing so. He used Raisel as an example, pointing out that he had let his guard down and had many openings. Late emphasized that if he wanted to, he could kill Raisel right here and now. Finally, Late mocked Russell, calling him a pathetic weakling, while praising Goldo as the strongest in the group. However, Late said that it would still take him about 10 seconds to kill Russell with just the weapons at hand. Raisel angrily warned Late to watch his mouth, calling him a filthy and arrogant bastard. Just as Raisel was about to attack, Princess Lumia stepped between them, demanding they both shut up, especially Raisel, as she was not pleased with how he was treating Late, the man who had saved their lives. Lumia ordered Goldo that if Raisel dared to disobey her again, he was to behead him on the spot for treason. Goldo took the order seriously, drew his sword, and placed it on Russel's neck. Terrified, Raisel knelt down and begged Lumia for forgiveness. Late realized that there was more to Lumia than met the eye. Until now, she had behaved like a normal young woman, but now she had shown a frightening side. Although the issue was resolved, Late could still feel the hostility from Raisel, and he decided he had to do something to extinguish this feud. He asked Princess Lumia for permission to challenge Russell to a duel, and proposed that the match would have no rules. Raisel still harbored resentment, vowing to make Late pay for his arrogance. However, Late realized he stood no chance against a skilled knight in a fair fight, so he decided to play dirty. Late explained that this wasn't a battle to the death, but just a match for them to understand each other better. All for the noble purpose of sparring. In reality, it meant nothing to Late. He just didn't want to kill the princess's guard in this situation, as it would be a huge mistake to do so. Princess Lumia thought about Late's request and recalled that, although Russell wasn't quite ready to be a true knight, he still possessed formidable strength. Goldo agreed with the princess and emphasized that Russell was ranked in the top 3 of their elite royal knight order and should not be underestimated. A short while later, they all went out to the backyard. Raisel reminded Late that he had stated there would be no rules for this match and just wanted to confirm it, as he was itching for a fight to blow off some steam. Late replied that the rules would remain the same, and he challenged Raisel to attack him with the intent to kill. He wasn't worried because he had instant healing potions ready. He then held up a potion for Raisel to see, making Russell think to himself, "What the heck is this?" Princess Lumia explained that it was a level 1 recovery potion, and it worked very effectively. Raisel was shocked to learn that a supposed commoner like Late possessed such a high-level potion, and began to suspect whether Late was truly a commoner. Goldo commented that he also suspected Late was more than just an ordinary commoner, since the potions he possessed were enough to keep a normal person living comfortably for the rest of their life. Raisel then asked Late if he was a physician, because in this world, those who concocted potions were called physicians, especially since Late had even prepared an antidote. Goldo guessed that Late used to be a private physician for a kingdom, but Raisel doubted that, as it was unlikely a kingdom would let go of a physician who possessed something as precious as a level 1 recovery potion. Late found the conversation about physicians very strange, because in his world, such people were called alchemists. Goldo and Raisel continued to speculate that Late was a physician who had fled his kingdom and hidden in the forest, which Late found absurd. However, he'd rather they think that than know the truth that he came from another world. Late let out a loud cough to get their attention, and reminded them that he didn't appreciate them digging into his past. He also stressed that he wanted the match to start immediately. Goldo volunteered to be the referee for the match. A few minutes later, the match officially began. Both fighters got into their ready stances and stared into each other's eyes. In Late's left hand, he was already holding a flashbang, and just a few seconds later, he threw it at Raisel to blind him and create an opening to attack. While Russell was temporarily blinded, Light snuck up behind him and prepared to deliver a downward strike. However, Raisel still managed to block the attack, despite being unable to see. Late was impressed and had to admit that Raisel was indeed an excellent knight. Immediately after, Raisel swung his sword, aiming straight for Late's throat. Late understood that a true swordsman could sense an enemy's presence, and it was clear that Russell had reached that level, even though he was only 20 years old. This explained why Russell was able to block Late's attack. On second thought, defeating Russell wouldn't be too difficult for Late. All he needed to do was hide his presence, get close enough, and then stab his opponent in the neck. However, Late felt that this duel would only be meaningful if he won by clearly demonstrating the disparity in their power. Late realized Raisel had placed great faith in his sword, so the only way to win was to destroy that very sword. He felt confident in his ability to win the duel. When their swords clashed, Raisel had no choice but to admit Late was a formidable opponent. But Late smiled and said that he could go even further. Both their swords were locked in place, and the fight now depended on raw strength. Raisel warned Late that he couldn't win with brute force alone, but Late disagreed. In an instant, Late used his weapon to completely shatter Raisel's sword, leaving Raisel gasping in shock. Late leaped into the air, intending to deliver the final finishing blow, but suddenly Goldo yelled "Game over," signaling that the fight had gone too far. Late held back his attack and walked away, knowing he had defeated Raisel perfectly. Late had used theft magic during the fight, a technique that shouldn't be used in a prolonged battle because it puts immense strain on the human body. This time, he only suffered mild muscle pain, but if he had used it against a higher-level opponent, his body would have been in excruciating pain. So, he silently thanked his lucky stars that Raisel was such a mediocre loser. Late turned back and saw Raisel crying because his sword had been destroyed, wondering why his sword had broken so easily. Late replied that he had used a special technique to break the sword, but that was actually a lie. He had used transformation magic to shatter the sword. Goldo then admitted that he hadn't seen Late use any special sword techniques, and he couldn't believe Late was strong enough to pull that off. Late then asked about Raisel's sword, whether it was considered a good one. Goldo replied that it was a masterpiece, forged by a master blacksmith, and that Raisel had received it upon his promotion to Royal Knight. After hearing this, Late felt a pang of regret for having broken the sword, and offered to fix it. But when Late picked up a piece of the sword, Raisel angrily snatched it from his hand. However, Raisel acted foolishly, grabbing the blade with his bare hand and cutting his fingers. Clearly, Raisel was still holding a grudge and started to walk away, but Princess Lumia ordered him to stop, asking him if he wasn't ashamed of himself for acting like a coward. The princess scolded Raisel for not only insulting Late earlier, but also for the way he behaved after his defeat, which was a disgrace to the entire kingdom. Princess Lumia then bowed her head and apologized to Late, taking responsibility for Raisel's foolish behavior. Goldo advised the princess not to bow for too long and reminded her of her royal status. Lumia then asked Goldo what the appropriate punishment would be for Raisel's shameful conduct. Goldo replied that Raisel had repeatedly disobeyed orders and his actions were a disgrace to the kingdom, so the death penalty was unavoidable. Hearing this, Lumia's eyes widened in shock, just as Late had predicted. Since Lumia was only 15 years old, she didn't want to execute someone she had known for a long time. Instead, Lumia suggested finding an alternative punishment to execution, but Goldo reminded her that according to the kingdom's law, a knight who dishonors the royal order of knights must face the death penalty. Even Raisel agreed and accepted his fate. Suddenly, Late got everyone's attention and said there was no need to kill anyone. He thought to himself that this law was too strict. If the death penalty was applied for rude words, the entire population of Earth would have been wiped out long ago. He understood that the Order of Knights was responsible for protecting the royal family, so such strictness was somewhat justified. However, Late could sense that Princess Lumia didn't truly want to execute Raisel. At the same time, if the king woke up to find a royal knight had been executed, it could negatively affect the upcoming negotiations. Although Late was under no obligation to protect Raisel, but he figured protecting Raisel might be beneficial in some way. He stressed that he was the victim, but he didn't care about what had happened. Goldo said the matter was far more serious as it involved the royal knights. He placed a hand on his chest and recounted how the royal knights were formed to protect the royal family. He also explained that disgracing the order's honor was the same as insulting the royal family, which was why their rules were so strict. Late immediately understood that the issue was about honor and reputation. He then told Goldo that the only people who witnessed Raisel's cowardly and useless behavior were him and Lumia. Therefore, if the three of them kept quiet, no one else would find out. Lumia and Late both agreed to keep it a secret, making sure no one else found out about the incident. Goldo thought for a moment, then proposed that the princess entrust Raisel's life to him and Late. He explained that the royal knights had an exception that allowed for a punishment to be postponed if the offender was assigned a mission. Late immediately understood Goldo's logic. The execution would be delayed until the mission was completed, and if the mission never ended, the punishment would never be carried out. However, to do this, they needed the consent of both the victim and the accused. Once the exception was approved, Goldo would decide the details of the mission as he saw fit. Raisel then bowed his head in shame and gave his thanks. Goldo then reminded Raisel that if he ever did it again, he would lose his head and it would be served on a platter. He also told Late that if he ever changed his mind, he just had to say the word and Raisel would be executed on the spot. Late was surprised to realize he suddenly held the power of life and death over Raisel, when his original plan was just to show off a little in a practice match. He never imagined things would escalate this far. That afternoon, Late brought another bowl of water for Princess Lumia so she could wash her unconscious father's face. As Late touched the bed, he asked Lumia if the bed felt a bit hard. Lumia sat down to feel it, then remarked that she found all the furniture in the house to be first class. Late smiled and said he planned to use a piece of Raisel's sword to make an even better bed. Raisel's sword had been confiscated and given to Late after the earlier dispute. This was an order from Princess Lumia, and Raisel couldn't disobey unless he wanted to die. So, however unwilling, he was forced to hand the sword over to Late. Lumia thought Late would use the sword to make a metal frame for the bed, but he used it for the mattress instead. She immediately thought he was planning to use it for torture and reminded him that even with a just cause, torture was illegal, unless you were acquainted with the royal family, in which case you might get away with it. Late assured her that he wasn't going to torture anyone and was just making a normal bed. Lumia must have imagined a bed with swords sticking out of the mattress, which sounded crazy but wasn't actually a bad idea, just kidding. Then, Late used transmutation magic to create springs, which would act as the support for the mattress. As he was getting things ready, Raisel watched him crafting with the sword, and as if he couldn't look any worse, his face twisted into an extremely ugly expression. Just then, Goldo shouted his name, demanding Raisel get back to work. Before long, Late finished installing the springs for the mattress, covered it with a sheet, and used magic to fuse everything together. When he was done, he sat on the bed and commented on how comfortable it was, then suggested Lumia give it a try. Lumia watched in amazement, seeing that Late had crafted this incredible bed from pieces of a metal sword. She sat down, and the springs bounced her up into the air. When she landed, Lumia excitedly remarked that she had never seen such a wonderful and soft bed in her entire life. Lumia began to praise Late, not only for his ability to craft amazing potions, but also for making an excellent bed from sword fragments. He realized that if he mass-produced them, he could make a huge profit, but he wasn't really interested in the idea. Late told Lumia he was going to go around the house and make a few more beds like it, since he had some free time. After Late left, Lumia jumped on the bed like a little child, which in fact she was. She even tried lying in all sorts of positions. Sleeping positions, of course. Just then, Late came back in and tossed her a pillow he had just made. Lumia hugged the soft pillow tightly and blushed as she watched Late leave the room. A little later, Lumia saw Late working and had a request, but she hesitated to ask. Late noticed this and asked her if she needed something. Finally, Lumia asked in a small voice if she could take the bed back to the royal palace. Late was surprised that she was so hesitant over just a bed. He said it was no problem. As long as he had enough materials, he could make as many as she wanted. This made Lumia overjoyed, and she thanked him while hugging her pillow tightly. Meanwhile, Raisel was being worked to exhaustion. The next morning, Lumia was surprised to see that her father was awake. The king was also stunned to find himself still in one piece. Late explained to him that it was all thanks to a grade 2 potion that he had brewed himself. The king laughed out loud in disbelief, finding it impossible to believe that a commoner could create such a potion. King Lias then demanded that Late prove his skills by crafting a potion right before their eyes. Late agreed, but on the condition that the king explain why he was injured in the forest. The king stared at Late with a cold gaze, asking if he dared to bargain with the king. However, the king's stern look quickly turned into a smile, and he accepted Late's request, but only after he successfully crafted a true level 2 potion. Lumia worriedly asked her father if he was sure about this decision. King Lias reassured his daughter, saying that he truly needed help and that a physician capable of brewing a level 2 potion would be very useful to him. They went into the kitchen together, where Late began crafting the potion. He laid the ingredients on the table, including manhhua grass as the main base. Then, Late put the grass into a bowl and started grinding it with a pestle. The king praised his skillful execution. Late humbly replied that it was because he was a professional physician, though that was just a lie. Once he finished grinding and achieved the desired consistency, he began to boil the mixture. The potion continued to boil until nightfall, and finally it was complete. The potion had a transparent red color, indicating that it was a genuine level 2 potion. He then poured the potion into a vial ready to be used. The king offered to test the potion, even though he wasn't injured. King Lias took a knife and cut his own palm, causing Goldo and Lumia to cry out and worry for him. He opened the vial and poured it onto the wound. The cut healed instantly. Even Late was surprised that the king would test it on himself as if he were just a commoner. The king then said that he couldn't test it on others, and if the potion truly worked, then there was nothing to worry about. The king, the princess, and Late sat down to talk. King Lias decided to keep his promise by explaining their situation. However, Late had to swear not to reveal the contents of their conversation. Late agreed, and the king finally confessed that their mission here was an assassination. The king revealed that the prince's bodyguard was murdered by a mage named Satarx, who used teleportation magic. Although the king was skilled in combat, he couldn't react fast enough and was injured. Now, Late understood that they were on an assassination mission and were relying on teleportation magic to accomplish it. However, teleportation magic isn't strong enough to kill someone, but if a trap is set before teleporting, even the highest level players can be eliminated. After the king finished his story, Goldo immediately knelt and apologized for not risking his life to protect the king. Lias told Goldo to raise his head, reassuring him that no one could have protected him in that situation. The king then assumed that it was Goldo who had defeated the monster in the forest. Goldo immediately corrected him, saying that it was Late who had killed the monster. Lias was surprised to learn that a supposed physician could take down a monster. Late replied calmly, saying that all he did was use poison. At that moment, the king recalled that he had suffered a fatal wound from the bear and wondered if it had all just been a dream. Late then showed the king a bottle of poison he had prepared from natural ingredients. Lias concluded that Late must be an expert in poisons. Goldo also added that even though Late claimed to be a physician, he was very skilled in hand-to-hand combat and had even defeated Russell in a mock battle. The king recalled that although Russell was useless, his swordsmanship was still considered top tier. Yet, an unknown physician had defeated him so easily. Goldo also mentioned that Late had used a special technique to destroy Racel's prized sword. After hearing everything Late had done, the king asked for Late's help in returning safely to the palace. Since the surrounding forest was very dangerous, the assistance of an excellent physician like Late would ensure their safety. However, Late didn't think that returning to the palace would solve all their problems. He explained that whoever summoned the monster to attack them certainly wouldn't be waiting to welcome the king with a party. Satarx, the one behind this, might be being executed for treason right now. Late also remarked that Satarx was a shady character to begin with, and if the king were to suddenly disappear, Satarx would be the first to be suspected. Late interrupted Lias, asking why someone as suspicious as Satarx would be associated with the prince's guard. At that moment, the king realized he had made a huge mistake in entrusting the protection of Prince Casas to Satarx. Late then asked just how suspiciously Satarx had been acting. Lias replied that a series of suspicious deaths had occurred around Satarx, and there were also rumors that he put strange things in his food. In fact, the king admitted that he would rather hire adventurers than have Satarx protect Casas. From what Late had observed, Satarx's actions clearly deserved nothing less than execution. The king also realized he should have executed him long ago, but instead the only punishment he gave him was washing dirty dishes. After that, he was immediately forgiven. Late then asked if anyone had ever objected to the king's poor decisions. However, no one spoke up, not even the talkative prime minister. At that moment, Late began to understand how that sorcerer was manipulating the situation. It was mind control magic, an extremely complex spell to cast. However, Late explained that the success of mind control depends on the level of manipulation. Still, if he carefully investigated the anomalies in their memories, he believed he could break it. Meanwhile, inside the castle, Satarx realized that the mind control spell he had placed on Lias had been broken. He began to wonder if someone had freed the king from his spell, but to him, it didn't matter. Satarx swore that no matter what happened, he wouldn't allow anyone to interfere with Luris Mars's orders, whoever it might be. He also mentioned that he would make someone named Rias suffer a slow and despairing fate, if Rias was still alive. Meanwhile, at Late's house, the king asked if Satarx was hated by everyone, and Late confirmed it. Suddenly, the three royals' eyes shot wide open, as if they had just awoken from a deep trance. Just then, the king realized the bitter truth. Everyone in the castle was still allied with Satarx despite his cruel actions. Lias didn't want to believe that his loyal subjects would conspire with Satarks to drive him from the throne. Late simply concluded nonchalantly that their politics were truly terrible. Lias went on to say that not many kings cared as much about their people's lives as he did. Since his coronation, the royal family's spending had been cut by more than half compared to the previous generation. However, the solution wasn't to completely cut necessary political expenses, or else he'd be left with nothing. Late understood the current situation perfectly and was certain that Satarks had used mind manipulation magic, brainwashing everyone in the castle. However, the king didn't fully understand the meaning of the mind manipulation magic Late mentioned. Late then explained that it was a type of magic used by sorcerers to control people's minds, forcing them to do their bidding. Late knew all about mind manipulation from the world of VLO, but there, only villainous NPCs were allowed to use it, not players. Lumia went on to state the obvious, that no one suspected Satarks precisely because of his mind manipulation magic. However, something was still bothering the king. Lias realized that Satarks could have easily manipulated him without banishing him from the kingdom, so he wondered why he didn't. Late then explained that all royalty and high-level adventurers have high resistance to mind manipulation, which was probably why Satarks chose to banish him from the castle instead. Lias understood Late's reasoning, and concluded that he had to put an end to Satarks' tyrannical rule. If Satarks was truly using mind manipulation magic, the kingdom would fall into his hands. However, he still didn't know how to do it. Late then suggested a basic solution, which piqued the king's curiosity. He explained that if they killed the user of the mind manipulation spell, everyone under its control would be freed. However, Lias still didn't feel at ease with Late's suggestion. He made it clear that Satarks was not an opponent who could be easily defeated. Late replied that if the simple way didn't work, they should try a more complex method to eliminate him. Lias explained that the royal palace's defense network was very strong, and sneaking inside was nearly impossible. Late replied coolly, saying that if a defense network that tight let a mind-controlling sorcerer slip through, then breaking in wouldn't be that hard. Lias seemed annoyed by Late's smugness and stressed that only a professional, highly trained assassin could possibly breach the palace's defenses. He added that even if such a person existed, they would have no way of contacting them. Late told him not to be so quick to judge and offered to introduce them to an assassin. At first, Lias was skeptical that Late actually knew a professional assassin. However, Late reminded him that with his level 2 potion-making skills, it wasn't strange for him to have special connections. The king then admitted that Late had a point, but Lias explained that Satarks couldn't be killed by just any assassin, because his palace was virtually impenetrable. It had defeated many assassins and infiltrators in the past. Late then asked impenetrable in what way exactly? He also asked if the defense system included legendary barriers like the indestructible barrier, the magic blocking barrier, and the space disruption barrier. These were all the strongest types of barriers in VLO, and if used together, they would be incredibly difficult to destroy. However, the king quickly clarified that it wasn't a legendary barrier. He further explained that the palace's outer wall was only a defensive level of the immovable barrier class. Late quickly realized that this kingdom's defense system was useless, since the immovable barrier was only considered mid to low tier in VLO. He asked for more details about the castle's defenses, specifically the exterior windows. Lias replied that there were no defensive spells on the windows because the distance from the ground outside to the windows was too great for magic to reach. Late chuckled to himself, realizing this assassination mission would be incredibly easy for him. It had been a long time since he'd had such a simple assassination job. He then mentioned his ability to carry out the assassination, but stressed that it all depended on the reward he would receive. Lias reminded Late that Satarks was a high-level sorcerer, protected by an immovable barrier. Late nonchalantly replied that if he couldn't handle someone like Satarks, then he didn't deserve to call himself an assassin. Lias said that if an assassin as talented as Late described truly existed, he would desperately need his help immediately, but he was still worried about whether the assassination plan would succeed. Late confidently asserted that the mission would definitely be a success. He even proposed that the reward could be paid after completion, and if he failed, he would kill himself on the spot to prove his honor. Lias, after some consideration, agreed to Late's terms and asked to be introduced to the assassin. Suddenly, Late snapped his fingers and his entire arsenal of assassination weapons appeared. and then introduced himself to all of them as a doctor, and now an assassin. Everyone was shocked because they all thought he was just an ordinary doctor. He then brewed a pot of tea for everyone. Late continued to explain that as an assassin, being a doctor was a valuable asset, because the simplest and most effective way to kill a target is with poison. He said this while sipping his cup of tea. Lias remarked that Satarks had likely prepared countermeasures for every type of poison. Late replied by giving an example of an undetectable drug, as it only becomes toxic once it's inside the victim's body and creates the poison from within. Lias then asked Late how he would administer such a poison. Late replied that he would infiltrate the areas growing food for the royal family and spread the poison in the soil, allowing it to be absorbed by the crops. Then he would create a magical flying tool, hide among the clouds, and mix the poison into the rainwater, making it impossible to detect. Lias was skeptical, not believing Late could create a magical flying tool so easily. Without another word, Late grabbed a piece of metal and used his Beastole spell to create a gun. Then his magical familiar threw a teacup toward the king. Just as the teacup was about to hit the king, it was shattered by a bullet from Late's gun. Late explained that the purpose of this act was to prove that he could create any magical tool as long as he had the right materials. Then, Late asked everyone to remain silent and leave, so he could carry out the assassination. Lias looked at Late with a serious expression and said that if Late could eliminate Satarks, he wouldn't hesitate to grant him any reward he requested. Late, in a clear and determined tone, replied that he wanted a piece of land for a workshop, to keep his identity completely confidential, and to establish a partnership with the kingdom. Lias understood why Late wanted the land, but he didn't quite grasp the parts about concealing his identity and the partnership that Late mentioned. Late explained that if his identity as an assassin were exposed, it would cause a lot of trouble for him. He also wanted to hide his crafting profession from everyone except those he trusted. As for the partnership, he explained that it wouldn't matter who had a higher status. If one party wanted something, they would simply ask the other, and that party would be free to accept or refuse without any coercion. Lias realized that this partnership was crucial, but he had no other choice but to accept. They shook hands, officially sealing the deal. Late's target was the mage Satarks, and his reward was a piece of land for a workshop, the concealment of his identity, and a partnership with the kingdom. Lias then asked about the estimated time to complete this assassination mission. Late replied that the poison-spreading method he'd suggested earlier would take several months to be effective. Therefore, a direct assault would be the faster option. King Lias said that he wanted to use the faster method, but it had to be guaranteed with no chance of failure. He asked if Late could pull it off. With a wicked grin on his face, Late replied that it all depended on the enemy's defenses. Late then asked Lias for a detailed explanation of the palace's defensive preparations and the magical assassination techniques Satarks had used. Lias said he was only familiar with the defensive situation from when he was on the throne, but it might have changed since his exile. Late wasn't bothered, saying he would investigate the more critical parts himself. Meanwhile, Princess Lumia was walking down the hall when she heard voices coming from the living room. She entered and saw her father just as he was finishing his explanation of the kingdom's defense system. Even though the kingdom was no longer his, Lias still clung to the dream of reclaiming his throne. After he finished the explanation, Lias asked Late if he could do it. Late replied that if the information Lias provided was accurate, then this would be one of the easiest assassination missions he'd ever encountered. He even added that just by using magical tools, he could handle everything. Lias was astonished to hear Late call this mission easy. Late continued, saying he would carry out the assassination using magical tools, and the king, knowing nothing about assassinations, had to put his trust in Late's methods. Late asked Goldo to confirm if the royal capital was 3 hours away. Goldo replied that since they were near Leneralia, that was correct. Late stressed that if he had enough materials, he could finish Satarks off in just one day. He requested 500 magic stones, 30 kilograms of iron, and 10 kilograms of copper, then asked Goldo if he could provide them. Goldo replied that there was a shop in Leneralia that sold all the materials they needed. However, when Late asked if Goldo had any money, Goldo fumbled through his pockets and immediately realized, "Damn it, I'm completely broke." Late turned to ask the others if anyone had money, but they were all broke. Despite all his assassination and crafting skills, Late was also broke. He asked Goldo if they could buy the materials on credit. Goldo replied that he would contact the Knights Guild to check, but since he didn't want to reveal that he was still alive, he hesitated. Late asked if they could get the materials without going through the guild. If they could just get the copper and iron, he could hunt monsters for the magic stones. However, Lias pointed out that 30 kilograms of copper and 10 kilograms of iron was a lot of money, and getting those materials without the guild's help would be very difficult. Late understood that copper was a rare metal, and that smelting technology in this world was still primitive, which made the cost extremely high. He knew he couldn't pass up these crucial materials, so he decided to sell something to get the necessary funds. Late noticed the level 2 potions on the table and asked if he could sell them. Lias replied that he could, but the selling price wouldn't be ideal. Late then asked if he could sell a different kind of potion if time wasn't a constraint, since he could brew a level 4 potion. Upon hearing level 4 potion, everyone was stunned, as it was an incredibly rare item. However, Goldo was skeptical that Late could actually pull it off. Lias also warned that if Late created such a high-level potion, he would attract attention, the very thing he was trying to avoid. Lias explained that potions were extremely valuable in the kingdom. Level 2 potions were supplied only to the royal family, and it took 3 years just to brew a single vial. Level 1 was even rarer, so the mere thought of a level 4 potion left them all in disbelief. Late, after hearing the advice, suggested brewing level 0 potions, as they were still valuable but wouldn't draw any attention. Lias agreed it was a more sensible choice. Late then decided he would prepare the level 0 potions. He remarked that level 0 potions were also on the same level as Lias's IQ, which made everyone a bit awkward. Next, Late poured purified water into a vial of level 2 potion, making everyone anxious as they stared at him with baffled expressions. Late explained that diluting a high-level potion would downgrade it to a lower-level one. Lias replied that he understood that, but what worried them was that Late had just diluted a precious potion, something the kingdom only acquired once every few years, into a level 0 potion, the kind that was readily available in any market. Late told them to calm down, stressing that he could brew more level 2 potions anytime he needed to. He also reminded them that saving the kingdom was far more important. Lias admitted that this was the first time he'd ever seen a potion being brewed this way, so he was quite surprised. After a while, Late finished brewing and neatly arranged a large batch of level 0 potions, ready to be sold. Goldo asked if he could sell the potions at night. Late was surprised and asked why he had to wait until evening to sell them. Goldo explained that if he sold them during the day, he'd easily be spotted by the chivalric order. He also wasn't sure who his enemies were, so he wanted to avoid any risks. Late understood the situation and came up with a way for Goldo to move around without being detected by the chivalric order. He used magic to create a magical disguise tool. Goldo took it and immediately transformed into an ugly, middle-aged man who looked like he'd lost all will to live. Lias remarked that he couldn't recognize Goldo anymore. Late then showed Goldo his reflection, and Goldo was shocked by his unbelievably hideous face. He was even more surprised that Late could create such a tool. Late offered to help Goldo carry the 500 magic stones, but Goldo said not to worry, as Raisel had already taken care of it. And just when Late thought Raisel couldn't get any uglier, he exceeded all expectations by using the disguise tool to hide his true appearance. Late said the tool was ready, but reminded them that their voices wouldn't change, so they needed to be careful who they interacted with. Goldo then mentioned he wanted to return to his normal face when negotiating, and Late explained that they just had to whisper the word terminate to end the disguise and activate if they wanted to turn it back on. Now that Goldo and Raisel understood how to use the tool, they headed into the city to sell the potions. A while later, Late realized his house wasn't suitable for producing magical tools for assassination. He decided to build a more appropriate place. Late bent down to gather the materials he had prepared earlier. Lias appeared behind Late, saying there was something else he needed to discuss. He asked if the magical disguise tool could transform someone into a specific person. Late noted Lias's sharp perception and replied that it would take some time to perfect, but it was possible. He asked what Lias wanted to use it for, but Lias just said he didn't need it right away and that it would be useful in the future. He also requested a set for himself after the assassination mission was successful. Late agreed on the condition that he would be paid handsomely. Just then, Lumia poked her head out the window excitedly because Mackie had repaired her old clothes, making them look brand new. She noticed Late and her father seemed to be having a serious talk and asked if she was interrupting. Her father replied that they had just finished, so she didn't need to worry. He then went inside. With no one left to bother him, Late prepared to start building his workshop, using a combination of integration and transformation magic. Late reminded himself that his main goal wasn't to defeat the sorcerer Satarx, but to destroy the evil god Masura Zul. The current assassination mission and his partnership with the royal palace were just a temporary stop along the way. He thought that the kingdom of Mises could be useful in the fight against a mysterious evil god, since a god's power depends on the faith of their followers. Therefore, having control over a country could provide a great advantage. In short, Late just wanted to maintain a good relationship with the kingdom. A few hours later, Raisel and Goldo returned from their successful trip, carrying a large box. The king asked if they had achieved the goal of their trip. Goldo replied that they had acquired 30 kilograms of iron, 10 kilograms of copper, and 500 magic stones. Late was surprised that just 2 people could carry such a heavy load over such a long distance. He picked up the iron bar and immediately checked its quality. While it wasn't the best, it was still good enough to be used as crafting material. Late picked up a piece of iron, and when Goldo saw this, he was so shocked, his face became even uglier than usual. Goldo touched Late's skinny arm and remarked that despite skipping arm day, Late was still quite strong. Meanwhile, Late came across a type of herb that Raisel had picked for him, which would help in producing medicine and magic tools. This made Late flash a smile at Raisel. Raisel quickly turned away, as if to say, "Hold on, I'm not gay." Now that he had all the necessary materials to craft the magic tools, Late informed Goldo that he would be sealing the door and windows. If Goldo needed anything, he'd have to call from outside. Goldo whispered and asked Late if the formula for crafting magic tools was a secret. Late replied that it was definitely a secret, but the main reason for sealing the room was because of the dangers of the crafting process. A tool designed to kill people was obviously not safe at all. Late also suggested keeping an eye on Raisel to make sure that idiot didn't try to break down the door and cause more trouble. Late thanked Goldo and assured him he would handle the rest himself. He also reminded Goldo that since they were heading to the royal palace tomorrow, he had prepared an outdoor bath for Goldo to relax in. Late didn't want Goldo to mess up the mission, so he told him to go rest and recover his energy. Goldo was surprised to hear Late say they would carry out the mission the next morning, which implied he would use up all the materials before dawn. Late explained that he planned to stay up all night, as his situation didn't allow for any carelessness. Afterward, Late used a transformation spell to finish crafting his secret mobile shop. A moment later, a magical flying tool that Late had created flew into the common living area of the house, surprising everyone. Raisel and Goldo immediately took a stance to attack, but Late suddenly appeared. Late uttered the magic word, "terminate," causing the flying tool to vanish before it could harm anyone. He apologized for accidentally letting it escape the workshop during a test and explained that it was now complete. He then pointed to a giant block of goods and asked if they could carry it. Because it was the product he had crafted that day, Late had packed it carefully to ensure that nothing inside would be damaged, even if it was dropped or bumped. King Lias entered in a neat outfit, and from the look he and Late exchanged, they both understood it was time to begin the assassination mission. This was also Late's first assassination since arriving in this world. He then asked if everyone remembered the plan. Goldo began to recite the plan, explaining that they would go to the town in disguise, then wait at Wyron's hideout. When they received the signal from the magic tool, they would carry out the assassination and reveal themselves after the mission was successful. Lias told Late that after he defeated Satarx, he should leave the rest to him. Late then reminded everyone to use the disguise tool to hide their identities. After finishing his disguise, Goldo realized that his disguised appearance this time was even uglier than yesterday's. Late just shrugged, saying he had changed his appearance so as not to leave any impression. Late also noticed the tension in the team, especially from Princess Lumia. He knew full well that if this mission failed, the kingdom of Macy would become nothing more than a story in the history books. Goldo canceled his disguise and asked if the tool could change their gender, making Late hope that what he was thinking wasn't true. Goldo explained that when he went to the city of Lenalia yesterday, he saw wanted posters stating the targets were 3 males and 1 female, and that Satarx might have ordered a hunt for their group. He suggested changing the gender of some members of the group to reduce suspicion from the townspeople. Late understood the logic of this proposal, but he was also concerned that if the whole group were men, it would attract even more attention. Raisel then made a suggestion that their group should consist of 2 men and 2 women. Goldo agreed that this proposal was reasonable. Late then assigned roles to each of them. Goldo would be the mother, Raisel would be the father, and ironically Princess Lumia and King Leus would be the children. King Leus then mentioned that since the group was posing as merchants, he would be the most suitable to play the father. However, Late pointed out that based on the information gathered yesterday, it was very likely there were people in the kingdom watching him. Even if he changed his voice, his way of speaking and his demeanor would still be easily recognizable, so it was better for him to play a role that didn't suit him. Late then asked Goldo and Raisel if they agreed to the conditions, and both confirmed they were willing. Late explained how to change gender by pressing the button on top of the disguise tool. When Goldo transformed into a beautiful and charming woman, everyone was surprised, but she was a bit too tall. Raisel worried that Goldo's tall stature might attract attention. When Goldo opened her mouth and spoke in a deep voice like a frog's croak, both the king and Raisel quickly told her to shut up, warning her not to speak with that horrifying voice in such a seductive body. Princess Lumia couldn't hold it in any longer and burst out laughing, drawing everyone's attention to her. Lumia then apologized for laughing too much, and with the group's transformation complete, they were ready for the mission. The decisive moment for the kingdom of Mises had arrived. We see Late using his transformation technique to create small magic rats. These rats would play a key role in the success of the mission. All the mission data has been loaded into Late's system and everything is working perfectly. He ordered the army of rats to begin their advance. Meanwhile, the others had arrived in the kingdom in their ridiculous disguises. Everything was happening exactly as Late had predicted. The commoners in the kingdom seemed to be talking normally with each other, but their eyes were hazy and lifeless, giving off the feeling that they were being controlled by someone. Just then, Princess Lumia accidentally bumped into a man who was both fat and incredibly ugly. She shuddered in fear, not just because of his build, but also because of his utterly hideous face. Raisel immediately stepped forward and prepared to deal with the man, but Goldo stopped him and gave the man some money. After receiving the money, the man seemed satisfied and stepped back. After that situation passed, the group continued their journey, not letting the incident disrupt their plans. Goldo then asked Raisel if he still hated Late. Raisel replied that he no longer held a grudge because he realized that if things became tense and a conflict broke out between them, the entire plan would go up in smoke. Raisel seemed to have matured since he first met Late. He added that this moment was too important to let personal issues get in the way and ruin the mission's objective. Raisel then asked King Leus if he was alright staying in such a modest house. Leus replied that a more lavish place would easily attract attention and make others suspicious. Therefore, the best place for them to take shelter was Wyron's hideout. Meanwhile, Late was using his magical flight tool to scan the entire kingdom, searching for Satarx. With his reputation as a high-ranking mage, Satarx's magical power should stand out. A moment later, Late sensed a powerful surge of magical energy, signaling that Satarx was nearby. Immediately, he also sensed that a magical barrier had just been activated. Late continued to approach the barrier, realizing that it could be easily broken from the inside upon impact. However, using a magical tool to bombard it from the outside was not feasible, as the barrier was extremely durable against external forces. This meant that no matter how tight the royal palace's security was, they had completely overlooked the sewer system, which was only about 30 centimeters wide, the path Late's magical rats would use to infiltrate the castle. Just then, he heard Goldo's voice through the magical communicator he had given him earlier. Goldo reported that they had reached Wyron's hideout and asked about Late's situation. Late replied that although he was surprised to find the windows had magical barriers, it wasn't too big of a problem for him. Goldo then mentioned that, just as Late had predicted, all the commoners in the kingdom had been brainwashed, walking around like a horde of soulless zombies. Such a large-scale manipulation reminded Late of Satarx's terrifying power. He wondered why Satarx hadn't done anything with this power until now. Just then, Late suggested that perhaps Satarx had to wait for a specific moment. At that moment, a thought struck the king about why Satarx had to wait so long before launching his attack. However, he decided to dismiss it, hoping he was just overthinking. He then reminded Late of the request he made when they were in the forest, which was to protect Prince Cassus if they found him. Late confirmed this and understood that the king was placing his trust in him. We see a group of servants being allowed into the king's bedroom, where Satarx was sitting on the throne. One of the servants bowed and addressed him as the acting king. Late felt this was an opportunity to advance, so he directed his magical tool toward the bedroom door. However, he quickly discovered that there was an alarm magic surrounding the door, which would notify everyone if an intruder entered the room. Late decided to try sniping, but realized that his position was not within line of sight. He was surprised to see the room was better protected against assassination than he had thought. Late then listened in on the conversation, and heard a servant mention that they had dispatched numerous missionaries to more than 10 towns to promote conversion. The servant also mentioned that about 246 people had been contacted and spoken to about converting to this new religion. However, Satarx considered that number too low by his standards. Late listened to the entire conversation and understood that he was planning to change the people's religion, but the reason behind it was still unclear. He continued to listen and heard the servant report that the missionaries had tried their best, but there was strong resistance to changing beliefs after such a long time of trusting the old gods. Satarx remarked that mind control being ineffective for conversion was a terrible outcome. He ordered the servant to try even harder to prevent the country's collapse. Satarx also stressed that they must rely on the god Luras Mars. Late was surprised to learn that besides the goddess Myzes and the evil god Masur Azul, there were other gods who existed in this world. Satarx then reminded the servant how to deal with those who resisted conversion. Persuade them with fists and whips. To carry this out, they had formed a punitive congregation, which was scheduled to begin its activities the next day. Satarx approved and blessed the new religion. Late understood that it was just a moniker for a new religion, similar to what the goddess Myzes had told him. Instead of persuading the people, they coerced and tortured them, leaving most with no choice but to convert. Late asked Goldo if he knew anything about Luras Mars. Goldo replied that it was a new religion that had appeared in their country about 30 years ago. It was a faith with many practical benefits, which was why it attracted many followers. Late went on to ask what those benefits were. Goldo explained that those who believed in Luras Mars would receive free bread if they went to the church. This faith was based on the concept of charity towards others. However, Goldo also expressed his curiosity about the source of the money used to provide the food. Despite the dark rumors circulating about this religion, the people still loved it. Late concluded that this was a religion that attracted followers with bribes, and the source of the money was still suspicious. Goldo added that there were still some people in the country who believed in the goddess Myzes, mostly people his age, around 30 years old. Meanwhile, the majority of the youth believed in Luras Mars. Goldo asked why Late was suddenly asking about religion. Late replied that he was just curious. Just then, Late felt an extremely strong magical reaction. He immediately informed everyone that they had been discovered and their cover was blown. At that moment, an attack was launched straight at Princess Lumia. Goldo leaped in and blocked the attack for her. King Lias and Russell screamed out in worry for them both. The attackers turned out to be two former members of the chivalric order, who quickly recognized Lias and were shocked to see him alive, as it had been rumored he had died from illness. One of them remarked that the power Satarx had granted them was incredible. Their concealment was so perfect that the king was amazed, wondering how they could have discovered his location. Russell took a step in front of the king and announced that the two were Bata and Sting, former members of the chivalric order, and that they were likely being manipulated. Bata noticed they were curious about how their location had been exposed and began to explain. He mentioned it was thanks to old Kruin's marking spell. Raisel told them to shut up, as he didn't believe Kruin was the type of person to join the enemy. Even if they were being manipulated, it would be easy to tell from the glazed, clouded look in the eyes of those under control. One of the two former knights immediately called Russell a fool, and the other continued, saying he knew their group had sold about 100 level 0 potions at once. He also remarked that it was surprising they could return to the kingdom from the monster-filled forest in just one night. He went on to ask who had been helping them all this time, but Lias simply replied that it was a bedmaker in the forest. Lias then asked the two former knights their purpose for siding with Satarx to take over the country, suggesting it was perhaps for money or power. They both screamed power and said they were once weaklings. Only a strong king could give them true power, the power to be free, to rule over everything, and to take everything. According to them, a weak king, with no special powers and easily overthrown, was not worth protecting. These words were precisely what Lias had always feared, that the kingdom of Mysis would be reborn under the guidance of a new god. Just then, a mysterious sword appeared from the foot of one of the former knights. Raisel immediately charged forward to attack him. Lias kicked a chair toward the former knight's comrade, pinning him against the wall. Raisel continued his assault, slashing at the former knight and calling him a lowly traitor. At that moment, Goldo and Lumia arrived to witness the former knights in critical condition, on the verge of death. Lumia ran to embrace her father, creating a rare, touching moment in the story. However, the unexpected happened when the two former knights still had some strength left to fight. They suspected that the sword piercing his leg was the result of swapping magic. Immediately after, they both vowed to make everyone associated with the king suffer. Raisel and Goldo immediately told Lias to fall back so they could show these men the true power of the knights of the Mises kingdom. Raisel was unfazed by criminals like Bada, who relied on magic. He immediately used his kingdom's royal sword art, the flashing star cyclone technique, to launch a powerful attack. Bada felt that Raisel was looking down on him, so he immediately reminded him that thanks to the magical power he received from Satarks, he was no longer the useless person he used to be. As he spoke, Bada demonstrated a portion of his new power, surprising everyone, as he had previously been a weakling. Bada attacked Raisel, but Raisel held his ground, which impressed Bada. However, that was only the beginning. Sting then lunged at Raisel, catching him completely off guard with the surprise attack. At this moment, a flashback appeared, where Goldo had offered Late some food, knowing he had skipped dinner the previous night. Lias then reminded Late about the request to build something, asking about his progress. Late said he had finished, and had even made one for everyone. He had crafted a shoulder shield for Goldo, equipped with defensive magic. This shield was a perfect match for Goldo's fighting style, helping him block enemy attacks. Its defensive power was equivalent to an impenetrable barrier. Goldo used the shield to block Sting's attack, while reminding Raisel that their opponents were much stronger now, so he couldn't let his guard down like that again. Sting was surprised to see Goldo completely unharmed, despite taking a powerful hit, and was impressed by the shield's strength. Bada immediately told Sting to shut up, and declared that Goldo's shield would be useless against his magic. No matter how strong their defensive gear was, they would still have to dodge and counterattack if they wanted to survive. Bada then launched his butterfly fragment attack at Lias, but the expression on Lias's face showed that he had a way to deal with it. It turned out that before setting out on the mission, Late had given Lias an improved directional barrier for defense. Lias reassured his guards that they no longer needed to worry about him, as he was now fully capable of protecting himself. Sting and Bada were stunned to see Lias possessing a directional barrier, and not just a normal one, but a customized version. Lias then launched an attack at the traitor knights, but they managed to dodge it quickly. However, they were completely caught off guard by Lias's attack, as it was the first time they had ever seen a directional barrier used for an attack from the inside. This blow shattered their formation, creating an opening for Raisel to counterattack. Sting tried to use magic to block Raisel's downward slash, but was shocked when Raisel broke right through it. He then delivered the final, fatal blow, completing his finishing move. The weapon Raisel used was a magic sword called Burning Ceremony, a gift from Late before the mission. The sword was forged from a blazing tree and was said to be incredibly powerful. However, it could only be used once, so Raisel was advised to use it only when absolutely necessary. Before the mission, he had picked it up and dismissed it as a normal stick, thinking the so-called Burning Ceremony was just a ridiculous joke. Before the mission began, Late had told Raisel that the wooden sword would awaken the wielder's inner power when set on fire. But Raisel didn't believe it, thinking that burning the sword wouldn't change a thing. However, Raisel's attack wasn't strong enough to kill Sting, and just a moment later the man had already recovered. Sting immediately swore that Raisel would regret not finishing him off. Just then, Bada told Sting to shut up and realized something was strange. He noticed that their opponents weren't panicking at all from the ambush, showed no signs of trying to escape, and were even thoroughly prepared for the attack. At that very moment, Bada sensed that Satarks was in danger. It turned out a massive explosion had occurred, and the directional barrier protecting the kingdom had been destroyed. Lias began to wonder why there was such a huge explosion, when Late had only been assigned to assassinate Satarks quietly. Unexpectedly, the X-Knights decided they didn't need to check on Satarks, guessing that their opponents were waiting for them to do just that. Bada continued to insist that weaklings like them had no need to worry about a hero as powerful as Satarks. Meanwhile, Satarks was sipping tea on his throne, aware that there had been attacks on the kingdom but unsure who was behind them. Nevertheless, he was certain that no one could kill him that easily. Late analyzed the barrier and realized that after each attack, it could only be maintained for about 2 seconds. He immediately launched a new wave of attacks. Just before the blow landed, Satarx chanted a special protection spell, reinforcing the barrier and completely blocking Late's attack, creating a loud echo throughout the kingdom. At this point, Late realized Satarx had used the power of a long incantation to strengthen the barrier. When Lias heard that piercing sound, he wondered if everything was going according to plan. The X-Knight smiled smugly and declared that their master's power was clearly far beyond expectations. The same was happening to them. A different kind of aura was enveloping them. Sting then activated his nail machine gun technique, firing off a barrage of fierce attacks. Goldo quickly realized that their power had increased tremendously compared to just a few minutes ago. Sting then reminded him that he was no longer the weakling he used to toss around like a sack of potatoes. Goldo accepted that, but pointed out that Sting was as careless as ever. He struck the floor, causing Sting to lose his balance and realize he was in big trouble. Immediately, Raisel rushed into attack while Sting was disoriented. But suddenly Bada appeared with a sinister smirk on his disgusting face and told Raisel not to ignore him, but to spare him a little time. Raisel lunged at Beta, but Beta quickly countered with a magic spell. He taunted Russell, reminding him that he had once declared he would defeat him using the Oso royal swordsmanship. Just then, Bada felt a small cut on his face, making him wonder if it was Russell who had done it. What worried Bada even more was the fact that Raisel had managed to hold his own throughout the entire fight with a broken sword. Suddenly, Russell began to transform, like a Super Saiyan, and Bada noticed something different about Russell's sword. At first, he thought it was a magic sword, but then he discovered that Raisel was coating the blade with a special kind of ore. Raisel declared that his feelings hadn't changed, and there was nothing to fear from a trash knight who only relied on magic. He also said that this time, he would fight with all his might and show no mercy. From the hits he had taken, Bada realized that Russell had started to figure out his attack patterns and was no longer a worthy opponent. Bada arrogantly flashed a condescending smile and launched an attack, certain it would take Russell down. But just then, the king used his directional shield to block the attack. He reminded Russell that he was getting too far ahead of himself and ordered everyone to fall back and regroup, because the enemy's strength had far exceeded their predictions. However, he said they still had a chance to win if they used Late's item, so he told them to be patient and wait. Raisel coolly stepped forward and told Lias in the kindest way possible to shut his mouth, because playing it safe was not the best way to handle this situation. Raisel charged forward, declaring that he would not bring any more shame to the Mice's kingdom. Bada scoffed, telling Raisel he should just obediently listen to Lias. He then told both Russell and the king to look behind them. They both watched as a magical catastrophe hurtled down towards Goldo, who was completely oblivious to the danger. Lias screamed Goldo's name, but he was too far away to hear the warning. Without hesitation, both Raisel and the king dashed towards Goldo, but Raisel almost immediately outpaced Lias in his attempt to save him. As he ran, Raisel began to recall his recent failures. The disastrous sparring match against Late, and his failure to notice the tracking charm that had been placed on him. He blamed himself for missing so many opportunities and wondered if all his months of training were for nothing. Okay, this is just getting sad now. Raisel felt this was his moment to finally be a hero and save someone. He finally reached Goldo and leaped in front of him to block the attack. The spell pierced through his chest, leaving a literal hole in his heart. The scene flashes back to the night before their departure at Late's house, where they were checking all the equipment for the mission. Late had discovered a strange object attached under Rosel's arm. It was a magical tracker that had been there for a long time, explaining how their location had been compromised. Raisel immediately apologized for letting this happen and tried to pry it off with his other hand. Just then, Lias came up with an idea, to leave the tracker on Raisel's arm. He suspected that Satarx would send Beta and Sting to thwart their assassination mission, so he ordered Raisel to sneak into the royal capital with the device still on. Once Late was ready, their plan was to use the tracker to lure Beta and Sting away from the assassination site. Goldo and Raisel both warned that this mission was far too dangerous for a king to participate in personally. Lias replied that a worthy king could not sacrifice others just to save himself, all while striking an incredibly goofy pose. He then ordered Lumia to stay behind with Goldo, but she immediately protested. The king told Lumia to stop being foolish, reminding her of the dangers of the mission. However, Lumia argued that its danger was the very reason she had to participate, as she didn't want to be seen as a weak and useless princess if they succeeded in reclaiming the kingdom. The king and princess stared each other down. After a moment, the king finally relented and allowed her to join, but ordered Goldo that if the situation turned dire, he was to get Lumia away from there immediately. Back in the present, Russell lay collapsed on the ground, his body failing. While Lias and Goldo were still fighting, Lumia and her pet quickly poured level 2 potions on Racel in a desperate attempt to save him. However, his weakened body didn't respond. In a faint voice, Racel urged the princess to escape while she still could, hoping that Late could handle the rest on his own. On the verge of death, Racel continued to torment himself for having once again shamed the kingdom of Mices. But Lumia didn't care about any of that, she just told him to rest. Just then, Bata slowly approached, advising Racel to listen to the princess, as any further resistance was meaningless. Hearing Bata's voice, Lumia immediately snapped her head around in fear. Lias and Goldo saw her situation and rushed to her aid. Meanwhile, Bata remarked to Racel that despite having been classmates, he wondered why their fates had diverged so drastically. Bata held out his hand, offering Russell the power of Satark and promising him strength many times greater than his own. He continued to tempt him, urging Russell to abandon the king and princess, claiming they were just burdens holding him back from his ultimate potential. Meanwhile, Late was still struggling to break Satark's barrier, but to no avail as Satark was using a long incantation spell, a type of magic so complex that even a 5-character chant would challenge a skilled mage. Late realized that Satark was on a whole other level. He decided to move on to his next plan, attacking with the 3rd assassination weapon, the custom Dreadnought magic missile. This missile was so heavy from its massive payload of magical explosives that it couldn't fly unassisted. Even a 10-word barrier from Satark wouldn't be able to stop it. And now, the missile was hurtling straight towards Satark. Sensing the immense power of the incoming attack, Satark knew he had to bolster his defenses. He secreted a magical fluid from his mouth and began a 12-word incantation. The missile struck the barrier, but Satark's shield held firm, leaving Late stunned in disbelief that someone could cast such a long incantation. Not even the strongest mages in the VLO were capable of such a feat. However, Late cracked a sinister smile, realizing he needed to unleash his final option right away. Meanwhile, just as it seems Russell might accept Bata's offer, he signals his refusal, declaring that he is a royal knight, ready to devote his strength and his future to the royal family. Hearing this, a disappointed Bata sneers that Racel is no different from the other common puppets and will soon become just another stepping stone for their master's greatness. Lumia is enraged to hear Bata call the brainwashed citizens soulless puppets. Sensing danger, Racel tries to get up to protect the princess but immediately collapses, falling face down with a dead serious expression. Lumia asks Bata what he gains from tormenting the people like this. A moment later, we see Bata strike Lumia hard across the face. However, that wasn't his original intention. He had meant to kill her on the spot, but for some reason he hesitated when their eyes met. Bata also remarks that Lumia's small frame suddenly appeared immense to him. Lumia clenches her fists, and suddenly Goldo and Lias are sent flying into a wall by Sting, causing Lumia to cry out and worry for her father. Goldo tells the king and princess to stand back, sensing an immense magical aura coming from Sting. Sting approached with a murderous aura, a stark contrast to before, and asked Bata why he hadn't finished them off yet. Bata apologized, saying he had lost his composure. Just then, a dark shadow emerged from Sting's body. It reminded him that Sting, too, had just lost his composure, then turned to question whether Bata's loyalty to Luris Maris was wavering. Bata recognized the voice as Satark's and tried to explain the situation, but he was immediately told to shut up. Satark's went on to call both Sting and Bata useless trash from the former Mises kingdom for losing their cool against a former comrade. Just then, dark magic from Satark's descended upon them both, intending to burn their very lives away to fuel an attack spell. He said that this way, at least their lives would be of some use. The sacrifice of Sting and Bata created a hybrid magic spell called Spiral Requiem. However, Satark's was still unsatisfied and scoffed that this was a pathetic result for such a useless sacrifice. The massive Spiral Requiem was launched right at them, but Goldo managed to intercept the attack. He urged King Lias to escape quickly as he couldn't hold it back for much longer. However, Lias replied that he shouldn't be a fool, making it clear he wouldn't run away in such a critical situation. Goldo didn't like that answer, but he reluctantly agreed. Lias then told Lumia to get Russell off the battlefield. However, like father, like daughter, Lumia was just as stubborn and refused to leave. At this point, Goldo had accepted his fate, feeling as though it was all over. He began to thank Lias like a man on his deathbed, but Lias advised him not to give up so soon, and expressed his disgust at how Satarx treated his own subordinates. If this continued, it wasn't just Satarx whose life would be burned as fuel for magic, but they would also die as prey to the monsters before that could even happen. Lias's only hope was that they could launch a powerful counterattack to even the odds. Just then, Raisel suddenly mustered the strength to stand up, his hand tightly gripping the sword-burning ceremony, his eyes filled with a dead, soulless gaze. Lias immediately told him not to act rashly, as his wounds had just healed. Raisel firmly replied that since he was the one who caused the situation, it was his responsibility to resolve it, even if it cost him his life. He swore he wouldn't die until the enemy was destroyed. Rossel's last hope was to believe Late's words, that the burning ceremony wasn't just an ordinary stick, but a weapon of great power. Rosel yelled, "Burning ceremony!" And the moment the words left his mouth, a massive explosion of fire erupted, leaving everyone who witnessed it gaping in awe. The small stick Rosel had been holding had now transformed into a massive flaming sword. The sword's special techniques and properties immediately flooded his mind. This transformation gave Rosel a surge of confidence, making him believe he could actually win this fight. Lias said he would protect Lumia and told Goldo and Rosel to focus on the main target. Rossel's soulless eyes now showed he was ready to end it all. He leaped high into the air, unleashing the Macy's Kingdom Imperial Sword Art, glittering binary star. Satarx was now using Sting as a vessel for his attack, so Rosel's technique didn't directly affect Satarx, but targeted Sting instead. Immediately after, a massive hole appeared in the sky from which a brilliant light poured down. Goldo wondered if this chaotic battle had finally come to an end. Lias remarked that Rossel's magical tool was so powerful it had ripped the very clouds apart. Lumia worried about how Late was faring on the other side. Suddenly, Raisel shouted for the princess to look behind her. Before she could turn around, a brainwashed civilian stabbed her in the chest, right between her two melons. The strange thing was, Lumia felt no pain at all. She just stood there, staring at the knife embedded in her chest, much to everyone's shock. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out from her chest, hitting the mindless civilian. It turned out to be a magic gun controlled by a magical entity created by Late. Lumia was still in shock, realizing that she had just killed someone, and that the shot had been fired from her own chest. Immediately, Goldo and Lias rushed over to ask if she was hurt. She replied that she was fine, all thanks to the magical entity. Specifically, the magical tool between her breasts had blocked the knife, preventing it from piercing her skin. Afterwards, Raisel's sword ran out of power, and he suddenly realized how lucky he was to have it. Without it, they would have all become monster fodder. Finally, he sent his heartfelt thanks to Late for everything he had done for them. Goldo suggested they move quickly to avoid the approaching crowds. Lias agreed, and the group departed immediately. Just seconds after they left, a massive beam of light shot up from the direction of the royal palace. Flashing back a bit, Late and Satarx were in a standoff, exchanging words. Satarx was furious that his opponent was such a thorn in his side, demanding that Late reveal his true identity. However, Late coldly replied that it was still too early for them to be formally introduced. Satarx stressed that he had to fulfill the great will of Masur Azul, and had no time to waste on a failure like Late. This caught Late's attention. When Satarx mentioned his god, he used the true name Masur Azul instead of Lura's Mars. This implied that Satarx knew the true identity of the god he worshipped. Then, a large explosion rang out, and Satarx assumed the fusion magic of Sting and Beta had been activated. However, he realized its power wasn't as great as he'd hoped, but it was still potent enough to have a significant effect. Satarx assumed they had defeated Lias, so all he needed to do was eliminate the one who had helped King Lias, and it would all be over. But before he could finish his sentence, he saw a massive hole in the sky and could no longer sense Beta and Sting's magic. He panicked, asking himself, what the hell is going on? Just then, Late unleashed a new attack. Satarx thought it was like the previous attacks and that he could easily defend against it. But he never expected his fingers to start rotting from the soul spell's impact. Late's trump card. This was the most powerful assassination spell, capable of taking down any mage, and it was called Soul Annihilation. Satarx's body began to decay. He continuously chanted spells to save himself, but it was useless. This spell was activated by the resonance of multiple magic stones, creating a special frequency that destroyed the soul. No matter how strong Satarx's magical barrier was, it couldn't stand against it. No mage could strengthen their soul, their very life source, because no charm existed that could protect the soul. But despite this harsh reality, Satarx refused to accept his defeat. He continued to chant, even as soul annihilation fully activated. Satarx wasn't dead, but was kneeling with several of his body parts gone. Observing the missing limbs and the strange magic surrounding Satarx, Late suddenly realized that what Satarx was chanting wasn't a normal spell, but a ritual. He had sacrificed his eyes and an arm to Masur Azul in exchange for his soul's protection. This magic was completely foreign to Late, as it didn't exist in Velo and far surpassed any kind of ordinary spell. As a strong gust of wind swept by, Satarx reappeared missing his eyes and limbs. King Lias and the others were being chased by the brainwashed citizens, forcing them to flee. They ran until they were cornered in a dead end. Just when all hope seemed lost, the Mayan manipulation spell suddenly vanished from their bodies. Lumia wondered if this was Late's doing, but no one could be sure. Shortly after, they witnessed magical entities flying from the bodies of the formerly brainwashed citizens back to a single gathering point in the sky. Everyone guessed that Satarx had infused his citizens with a portion of his magical power to manipulate them. The gigantic object in the sky was the accumulation of all the magic he had used. Late watched from a distance as Satarx's magical power far surpassed that of an ordinary mage and reached a godly level. That giant sphere of magic was a mass of energy so dense that it was impossible to dodge or defend against. And yet Late was confident that he could destroy it. He calculated the energy mass's speed, the distance between them, his remaining weapons, and the amount of magic left in his body. From this, Late concluded that everything would be decided in just 1 minute. He turned to Satarx, told him to proceed, and then activated his secret weapon. Satarx, sensing that this opponent would be a terrible threat to Masur Azul, used the triple monkey golem technique, summoning 3 giant magical minions to take Late down. Thunder and lightning exploded amidst the chaotic battle as both of them charged with all their might, knowing this would be the decisive blow. A few seconds later, a massive explosion erupted. With less than 1 second left on the clock, Late stood victorious, declaring the mission complete with a sharp needle in his hand. He immediately contacted his team, reporting that Satarx had been successfully assassinated. Everyone was overjoyed at the news, and Lias expressed his deepest gratitude, promising to reward Late for the mission's success. Lias also added that he would handle everything else and told Late not to concern himself any further. Looking back, Late had thought this would be a simple mission, but facing an opponent as powerful as Satarx just 6 days after arriving in this world had taken him by surprise. The tool Late used to take down Satarx was an ultra-thin needle, less than 0.2 millimeters in diameter. But the real surprise was that the needle was coated in the most potent and aggressive poison, one that was impossible to neutralize no matter what. Satarx was so focused on Late's flashy attacks that he never realized he had been secretly pricked by the poison needle, just as originally planned. Late said that even if Satarx had become 1,000 times stronger than before, he was still useless. Ever since accepting the request from the goddess Mises to destroy Masur Azul and Satarx, his first assassination target Late had faced countless difficulties. Satarx was an incredibly powerful opponent, able to cast spells that were over a dozen words long. No mage Late had ever known could have resisted the soul spell like Satarx did. Late knew full well that if Satarx had somehow managed to avoid the poisoned needle, he would have been the one to lose. Still, Late admitted that if it weren't for the goddess Mazes' request, he probably would have never had the chance to experience such an exciting assassination mission. Late felt grateful to the goddess for throwing him into such an interesting world. A few days later, Late and Russell faced each other, awkwardly. The meeting was mainly for Russell to express his gratitude to Late for everything he had done. He announced that the royal family would provide handsome compensation for the assassination, and officially declared the mission complete. Russell even bowed his head and apologized to Late for all the disrespect he had shown during their time working together. At the same time, he thanked Late once again for everything he had done. Late was quite surprised by this, because he knew Russell to be a bitter and petty person. But now it seemed Russell had changed. Before Russell left, Late gave him a new sword. When Russell drew the blade, he realized it was his old sword. Russell wondered how this was possible since he had seen his sword get destroyed with his own eyes. Late then explained that Maki, Lumia's magical pet, had recovered a piece of material from the sword when it broke. Using that, Late had analyzed it and crafted a new sword. So, Rosal should actually be thanking Maki. Hearing this, Racel blushed slightly and thanked Late. Hopefully he wouldn't get too romantic over this. Late also gave everyone some comfortable mattresses, since he knew it was what they were used to. After that, Racel pulled the cart full of mattresses back to the royal palace. Meanwhile, Late had a plan to completely destroy the evil god Masurazul. Since there was still some time, he wanted to use it to improve his equipment. However, he decided to start things slowly, putting his plan into action deliberately.